Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LB Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Olga.
And John Walters, journalist behind the Vermont Political Observer, joining us from the Montpelier area. So glad you can be here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, and if anyone's watching the YouTube, you can see behind me that we're actually, and a little bit in Emily's picture too, that it's actually nighttime for once. And so we were joking we could actually have had cocktails during this recording. So we fell down on that one, didn't we, Emily?
We did indeed. But
Right.
someday we are going to have our Montpelier happy hour, all of the guests that have ever been, fantastic cocktail party, and it'll all be worth it.
Yes, it will. Yes, it
Mhm.
will. Well, and we've designed a few cocktails too, so we have to have a tasting, like a cocktail tasting at some point too.
Mhm.
Um, so as we're talking about things that make us drunk, we are going to be talking about elections tonight. And, you know, it's interesting, Emily and John. I've been sitting with the questions I was going to ask you both tonight and thinking, in some ways, we have, especially on the federal level, been in one long campaign that feels a little bit like it has lasted. I don't think it feels like it has lasted for years. Meanwhile, we are just at the state level a few weeks away from November 5th. Early voting has already started. So I would love to hear from both of you before we dive into some of the specifics we wanted to talk about. What do you feel is still pertinent or has been maybe overlooked at this point in the campaigns as we approach November 5th?
Like,
Emily?
is your question like what hot take has not been hot taked yet?
I guess. I mean, well, going back to our conversation we had once, like what what's the conversation? What's the topic? What's the concern beyond who wins and who loses?
Yeah, yeah. I think one thing, I mean, one to remember, like the presidential race has actually only been like a couple months because we had a new candidate, right?
Yep.
Technically, but it still doesn't feel that
I know, it
way.
doesn't feel that way at all. And I think in a lot of our conversations, we're like, it all rests on this one race. But the
Mhm.
down ballot races, right? Like the control of the House, the control of the Senate. Um, I think, was that last week we talked about Windham County and what it means to like be a voter in Windham County where, we have such a strong Democratic majority. And so I think people lose track of how the House races in Vermont and the Senate races in Vermont can shape our ability to do the things that people are looking for. In this particular election cycle in Vermont, we haven't talked very much about the governor's race.
Mm.
But even more than that, we haven't talked about the fact that a man who claims to not align himself very much with his party has really gone quite far out of his way to both like sow general discontent with the state of affairs amongst voters and
Mm.
like go in really hard and deep for some fairly like hard right candidates. Um, and I don't know if that's like a hard hot take we haven't taken yet. But what I would say is the level of divisiveness and the amount of money that has poured into this race, both things, like incredibly negative mailers. I think that's fairly new in Vermont.
Yeah,
Within a, Vermont story that campaign signs are important. They're not. And that Vermonters want, really prefer us to be nice. I think they do.
I think
Um,
they do too. Yes.
and
lot of
So
pride on that.
yeah, so that's a big difference this year.
Hmm.
There have been a lot of Republican legislative candidates who have all gotten their mailers and other printed material from a company in Manchester, New Hampshire that seems to specialize in conservative hit literature. And I wrote a piece about it earlier this week about one candidate in particular whose mailers I got a hold of. And they're garish. There's all over the place, design wise, and the messaging is almost entirely negative. Um, it's attacking the Democratic incumbent in that particular race. And I have to think, since all of these candidates have bought their stuff from the same out-of-state outfit, and from a state known for a more negative bare knuckle style of politics, that this is pretty typical of, you know, how the Republicans are approaching races for the legislature. I think they think that there is widespread discontent with the legislature, and they think they can capitalize on that with this kind of negative campaigning. And as Emily alluded to, this filters down from the top. Governor Phil Scott, who has made his reputation being a nice guy, has been, on the attack all year against the legislature. And he talks about, coming together and working across the aisle, but his rhetoric is anything but. And it's been more salty and more negative and more hurtful than his rhetoric has been in the past. And that's a difference. And I think that has filtered down to the rest of the candidates. I have been thinking the last 2 days, although there is still a divide over Donald Trump, there is less of a divide than there used to be between hardcore conservative and quote unquote moderate Republicans in the way they are conducting this campaign.
Mm.
I don't know if it's a permanent change. I think a lot of it has to do with Phil Scott having his feelings hurt by all the veto overrides. But there is a more negative tone, and I remain unconvinced that it's going to pay off in big victories for the Republicans in November.
John, when you say you're seeing less of a divide between hardcore conservative Republicans and those who might consider themselves more moderate, along with the negative tone, are there other places where you're seeing less of a divide, whether it be on policy or whether it be on talking points, like?
Well, I mean, all of the Republicans are mounting very pointed attacks against the supermajorities in the legislature. Um, I think to some extent also there has been a kind of a recognition or a surrender on the part of moderate Republicans. Phil Scott has made the calculation clearly that the only way for him to eliminate the supermajorities and the override threat is to make common cause with some fairly conservative candidates because they're the only ones who are out there. There are a few moderates running for office in the Republican Party, but for the most part, they are very conservative people. And if he doesn't endorse them, he's not going to endorse anybody. He kind of has little choice, and he has made the choice that he is going to associate himself with some people who are from the other wing of the Republican Party in an effort to win more seats in the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
And I've even just my little view down here, for quite a while down here, the Republican Party is dominated by folks who tend to attend one of two churches,
Mm-hmm.
and not have very many of sort of your moderate sort of fiscal Republicans. All three of them still exist in the world. But Casey Coda, who's running in Bellows Falls as an independent, and I don't think a church going extremist. He's definitely like sort of more on the moderate, fiscal conservative side, um, has absolutely aligned himself. Like I saw him in an event this week, very much aligning himself with like extremist climate deniers,
Hmm.
um, like putting on an event together.
Hmm.
Um, and so, I think in politics, it is normal to say like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Um, and that can go in another direction pretty fast if we're not careful.
Well,
And Phil Scott and this whole like, didn't want to endorse Trump, endorse someone, like he still hasn't told anyone if he's who he's voting for president. And he has endorsed these people. And so, like the governor, Mr. Nice Guy, the rhetoric that he has absolutely inflamed, the mistrust in government, the distrust in government, there was a period a couple months ago when there were death threats. And the way people are being treated on the campaign trail this year is very different from what I've heard in the past.
hmm. Well, I think this is something I know I've been keeping my ear to the ground, and I suspect we will talk about again in the future is, there's been a real shifting, I think, in both parties, especially since Trump came on the scene, of some things pushing further to the right, some people no longer feeling at home in their current party, other things shifting further to the left. And, I think it's changed the landscape for a lot of people, I think, as far as like where are the new lines of conservative, progressive, moderate, you know, where those lines begin and end, I think has changed a lot for a lot of people. Um, can we talk a little bit, John, about the Senate races, particularly? Actually, you know what? I'm going to change that. I want to back up. And I want to talk about, because I think it will highlight the when we get to the Senate conversation, about some of what you're seeing on the landscape as far as donations go. We were talking beforehand, and Emily, will you remind us basically if people want to donate to a state Senate candidate or a House candidate, what are some of the caps and rules around that?
Yeah, so coordinated donations, meaning donations directly to a candidate rather than a donation towards a candidate getting elected, which is different.
Hmm.
Donations directly to a candidate from a single source or a PAC um, is $1,120 for a local candidate. That would be like a select board or something.
Okay.
$1,120 for a state representative. $1,680 for state senate or high bailiff.
Hmm. Interesting.
Um, so funny that high bailiff is in that same category. I guess it's the geographic area. 1630 to a county office candidate. That would be probate judge or an assistant judge kind of thing,
Hmm.
or sheriff. Contribution limits to statewide candidates is 4,480. And that's the same limit to political action committees.
Okay.
Limit to a political party is from a single source is $11,180. And for a lot of those sort of earlier positions I talked about, local candidates, state representatives, senators, there is an unlimited contribution from a political party to them.
So, in other words, the Democratic Party can give unlimited amounts to a Democratic candidate.
Mhm.
Okay.
Except for a statewide candidate.
Ah, okay.
And, and you can also make expenditures, independent political action committees.
That's
Um,
the next. So independent political action committees are have sort of their own set of rules if they're doing work separate to get someone elected, but not actually giving it directly to them, uncoordinated activities. So that would be a mailing, ads. There's all kinds of uncoordinated political activities you can do. And the spending on that this year, I think, is also quite high. One little thing I just want to make sure I mention, John, you have written a bunch about how hard it is to track all of this as a journalist. And I have also found it hard to even just track it for like a single candidate, or for a single donor. And the Secretary of State's office is in like beta testing of a new platform that they are going to launch after the election that I think you'll be really excited about because I got to beta test it. It was so much fun.
Ah,
Oh,
yeah, in
good.
a lot of
Data
ways,
nerds.
the Secretary of State's website is full of useful information, and a lot of it is pretty easily accessible. But there are things that are not good. And one of them is it's very difficult to track individual donors or groups that donate to a number of candidates.
And that's going to change in the next version.
Yeah. So, an example, just to wrap up the independent pack, an example of that this year in Vermont is an outside group called Americans for Prosperity
Mhm.
has been running ads and information um, targeting the legislature for enacting climate legislation like the Clean Heat Standard and the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that money is completely outside what a candidate spends. It isn't limited. The Americans for Prosperity can't coordinate with any candidates, but they can do their own thing
Mhm.
um, and put out their own information, and they can spend unlimited amounts of money. By national standards, the amount of money spent in Vermont is peanuts, but it's a lot more than we are used to seeing spent. And
Mhm.
I worry that it's kind of raising the bar for future campaigns and how much it's going to take for future people to seriously run for House or Senate.
Mhm. And I can imagine we already have a situation where incumbents tend to just win, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But if the bar is harder for you to raise money, it means it's harder for new people to come into the campaign. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, it's harder for many new people to come in. What we have seen on the Republican side this year is a number of candidates for state Senate who either are first-time candidates or who have run for office and lost before. And they have gotten a lot of backing from basically the same list of Burlington area business leaders and rich people. You see the same names over and over again giving $1,000 or more at a pop to these state Senate candidates. And some of them began their campaigns with very little prospect of being able to seriously compete. There's a guy named Stephen Heffernan in Addison County, and Addison is a solid blue county with two very established Democratic incumbent senators. He started out with very little money, and then suddenly after the primary, he got this flood of money, a lot of it from Chittenden County.
Hmm.
And he has enough money to seriously compete. I doubt that he's going to be able to win. But for those candidates in these races, their lack of previous experience and their lack of name recognition has not been a barrier to them to raise money. In fact, they've kind of been getting more money than they expected. And in many cases, they haven't really made the best use of the money that they've gotten. But um, it's a very uneven playing field. And
Hmm.
is if this trend continues, it is tilting more toward the Republican side in terms of the amount of money that's available.
Interesting.
So, Emily, in your case, you had a very spirited primary campaign against another person who was running as a Democrat but had the backing of business interests. And it forced you to be much more active, both in terms of personal campaigning and in terms of fundraising, in order to compete with that than you normally would have to. And that's a big change in our politics. And if it's a one shot, then that's really no big deal. But if it is a new level, then I think that is, a cause for concern.
I mean, if it's a new level of fundraising, it's a cause for concern and would like necessitate sort of a shift in rhythms and a shift in how the donor class organizes themselves in Vermont. If it's a shift even in energies, you know, if every other summer I have 3 months that I both can't make a living and can't further my policy work,
Yeah.
that's makes it even harder to serve. And like at the same time, my voters deserve a full-throated debate and conversation to have me talk to every single one of them. But it is definitely a shift because there is a lot of legislative work that happens during the off session as well.
Mhm.
Mhm. So for you, John, you've mentioned because you have followed the money in politics for several cycles now, and this changing goalpost. Um, you mentioned it could be favoring the Republicans. Are there other causes or seats or anything else you're seeing the money kind of circle around?
Well, the only statewide race that seems to be at all potentially competitive is the race for lieutenant governor.
Hmm.
David Zuckerman against John Rogers, who's a former Democratic state senator who's now the Republican candidate for lieutenant governor. He has gotten a tremendous amount of money. He started out with like nothing. He entered the race very late. As of July 1st, he had not raised or spent any money. And then suddenly he was getting all these four-figure checks from all these mostly people from Chittenden County,
Hmm.
mostly business leaders, real estate leaders, developers, fuel.
Which, like, if you know this guy, like, it makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at his donor list, he has gotten, I think it's about three-quarters of his money has come in donations of $1,000 or more. He's gotten, he presents himself, and he really is, a rural person, a working person who kind of embodies, in a way, what rural Vermont is all about. And yet his campaign would not exist as a serious threat to David Zuckerman without this flood of money from Chittenden County.
Hmm.
It's completely at odds with who he is and who he presents himself as.
So, do you think that that money is actually, for lack of a better phrase, money given against Zuckerman as it is, as much as it is for um, John?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, clearly these business leaders, I have dubbed them the barons of Burlington. Um, these business leaders are really trying to shift the balance of power in the state Senate.
Mm-hmm.
I think they have made a calculation that the House is beyond reach in terms of defeating the supermajority. But if they can if the Republicans can get a net gain of 4 Senate seats, which is a heavy lift, but not entirely out of the question, then
Mm-hmm.
then the supermajority in the Senate would be gone. The Democrats would still have a substantial majority, but they would no longer be able to count on getting 20 or more votes to override a veto. Um, and so all
Which
this,
is sort of interesting given that the Senate supermajority really quite predates the House supermajority.
yeah, but this year there are some crucial vacancies in the
Yes.
state Senate.
Yeah,
There are
that would be a great segue into what's happening at the Senate level. Yeah.
particularly there are 3 vacancies where very long time moderate Democrats who were very solidly entrenched in their potentially swing districts. Jane Kitchell and Bobby Starr in the Kingdom, and Dick Mazza of Grand Isle and Colchester. Um, they have been in office for so long that um, honestly, we have no idea how people are going to vote in those districts in an open election.
Hmm.
Uh, and so this is a chance for the Republicans to pick up 1 or 2 or possibly 3 seats. Um, and even if they don't defeat the supermajority, every seat they win makes it that much harder for the Democrats to override a veto. Um, and putting John Rogers in as the presiding officer of the Senate doesn't really make a difference in terms of potential override votes, but it does put him in a very central position in the Senate hierarchy. He is one of three. He would be one of three people deciding who sits on what committees and who chairs the committees. So it's not a completely inconsequential position, but it's all it. I think it's all
They're
part,
mostly inconsequential position.
mostly, but um, it's it's part of their effort targeting the Senate, I think, and to some extent, as Olga's question first put it, targeting David Zuckerman in particular, who's kind of the bête noire of the Republicans. So and some other people too, but that's probably a story for another day. The point is that these candidates there are like I think 5 or 6, maybe 7 candidates who have gotten a lot of money from these, Burlington area business leaders. And it has made them at least competitive in these races. It arguably may have put 2 of them in the favorite position to win seats that are now held by Democrats.
Can you tell me a little bit about how they're spending their money, John? Because that's something I've not had the
Well,
pleasure.
I mean, they send mostly $1,000 checks, sometimes bigger, sometimes a little bit smaller. But the vast majority of them are $1,000 checks. Often you'll see a whole bunch of them received by a candidate on the same day. One Senate candidate got a huge amount of money that basically jump-started his campaign on July 5th. And so you can't prove that there's coordination, but you've got the same group of people, the same couple of dozen people giving identical amounts to a select number of candidates, and it's all the same candidates. Mostly Senate, some House races. The Morgans in the Grand Isle House district, Michael Morgan, who's an incumbent, Leland Morgan, who is a former representative, they have basically gotten identical amounts of money from the identical group of Burlington area people with enough means that they can whip off 4-figure checks without thinking about it. And, it has given, Scott Beck and Representative Patrick Brennan, who's running for Dick Mazza's seat, more than $60,000 to spend, which is a huge amount for a Senate campaign, especially, outside of Chittenden County. It's just an extraordinary amount of money by Vermont standards.
And so how are those candidates spending the money once they have it?
That's what, yeah.
Well, I don't think they're spending it terribly well. And I think often it's because this money came in so late. These people, some of them didn't even file for candidacies. The guy who's the Republican who's running against Mike McCarthy in St. Albans was a write-in candidate in the primary. And he started getting lots of money right after the primary. And so it has made him competitive in the race. I don't think he's going to win, but it's made him a serious force to contend with. He has spent most of his money with that Manchester, New Hampshire company that, like, literally dozens of Republican legislative candidates have all bought their printed material from this same outfit. Some of the Senate candidates have done something even more unusual, which is they have spent a lot of money with what must be a very costly out-of-state consultancy named Battleground Strategies. It's based in Washington, D.C. It's by a guy named Jim Barnett, who cut his teeth as kind of an attack dog under Jim Douglas when Douglas was governor. Barnett has gone on to be a fairly powerful player in the consultancy field in conservative circles. So you've got state Senate candidates like Larry Hart Sr., who's running in Orange County, is spending a lot, thousands of dollars with this DC-based consultancy. And I
Hmm.
think it's because his campaign was such a sort of a last minute thing, and he didn't expect to get all this money, and now he's trying to spend it.
Hmm.
And our political calendar doesn't give a lot of time for these candidates to spend the money. Our primaries in mid-August. Um, Early voting started in early October. And already, as of last count, more than 125,000 votes had already been cast, already received and accepted for processing by clerks, which is probably going to amount to about 1/3 of the total electorate has already cast their votes, which
Hmm.
means that
Hmm.
money that's spent in these last couple of weeks is going to miss a large chunk of the electorate because they've already voted. So these guys who have gotten all this money have faced I guess it's the pleasant first world problem of having more money than they really know what to do with.
Hmm.
Um, I think that, and there's very little support or training on the Republican side for, potential candidates, on the Democratic side, particularly for women, there's Emerge Vermont, which has trained cadres of women who have turned into, powerful and successful politicians. There is nothing like that on the Republican side. So these
And
candidates are kind of thrown into the deep end of the pool.
So there are
I
actually sorry, Olga, you wanted to jump in?
we're over time
Okay,
in
let's
this
take a
section.
break.
So can I wait to part B, Emily?
Totally.
Oh,
I
cool.
think after the break, we should talk about what the vote, like the early voting means, and
Mm,
then ways people spend their money.
awesome. Let's do it. Okay, so you've heard that, folks. If you're listening on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, we will be talking about early voting when we come back, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I am your host and producer, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with John Walters, the journalist behind the Vermont Political Observer, as well as regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who is one of the three reps from Brattleboro. So glad you can both be here. We have been talking elections and election financing. And unfortunately, due to time, I had to cut Emily off. So we're going to be talking about early voting here in a moment, right after I say, hey, everybody, we want to thank BCTV for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with PEG stations around the state, and even a few other folks in New England who pick it up. Who knew? And Emily, we need to also remind listeners of something. What are we going to do there?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, and not the station nor employer of any of the people speaking.
Why, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So, early voting, John, you were saying right before the break that it's a good possibility that about a third of the electorate has already cast its vote. I think I heard you say.
Yeah.
And then, Emily, you were going to ask a question when I cut you off.
I don't actually remember exactly what I was going to say, but I have new thoughts, so that's
Okay,
okay.
good.
The third of the electorate having cast their vote is a lot, right? So,
Hmm.
Peachum, for instance, 37% of folks have cast their vote. 36% in a bunch of other towns. I mean, it's really like really high. And to remember that that's not like 37% of the people who will likely vote. It's 37% of the entire electorate.
Mhm.
So this is already more people than usually vote in a primary, for instance,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
Um, and even though I'd say like the way you spend your time knocking on doors gets more confusing when this many people have voted, because you have to skip a lot of doors, right? Um, Things like direct mail or phone calls or even knocking on doors, I don't think they're any less effective as the time goes on, because usually, and this is what I've heard, and like I think all political science is like a little bit of magical thinking, though it is science, I guess, somewhere. By the time any of the political science gets to me, I think it's moving closer to magical thinking. But decided voters tend to vote earlier, and undecided voters wait to vote. And mostly all of that mail and the door knocking and all of it, that is for undecided or unmotivated voters. Um, and so like all the things are still worth doing at this point in the campaign.
Mm-hmm. All
And
the
as
text messages. How
yeah,
many text messages have you both received
So I should
this
not talk
week?
about this on the air too much, but I'm going to do it anyway. I because of the particular way I wound up with the phone number that I have on my cell phone plan, I don't, I'm not on any lists.
Good on you.
mhm.
I like once a year, I'll get a text message and I immediately reply stop, and it doesn't spread from there.
I have received several, and of course, being a journalist, I'm always like curious to see how are they phrasing things and how are they wording things. But yes, I have received several this week. How about you, John?
Lots and lots. None from Vermont, which either that means that nobody in Vermont is texting, or it's the fact that I have a 603 area code on my cell phone number.
That
Uh,
could be.
of course, I haven't gotten any text from any New Hampshire politicians either. It's all national. And
Text banking is actually quite expensive. It's much more expensive than even an auto dialer. And usually Vermont campaigns don't even use an auto dialer; they just use phone lists.
Hmm. Well, I do have to say I was very impressed that I've received a few national texts for national campaigns, but for the most part, they've been Vermont. And I'm very
Oh,
impressed that I've gotten texts from progressives, Republicans, and Democrats. So I'm feeling very loved.
I love that for you.
yes, I wrote a piece. My most recent piece, as of this taping, was about the early voting turnout and the possibility, I think the likelihood that we are going to set a new record for turnout in this election.
That would
Um,
be good.
the old record was, let's see, the old record was set in 2020, which was the
Mhm.
last presidential election and in history, and the first presidential election where we had universally mailed votes,
Mhm.
ballots, because of the pandemic. And because of the pandemic, almost everybody voted remotely, voted early. Um, so like three-quarters of the vote was cast before the polls opened.
Mm.
Um, it's not going to be that many, but the total size of the electorate may actually be bigger this time than it was 4 years ago. Um, it's even possible, depending on how you work the numbers. Our current all-time record is 300, just under 371,000 votes. It's possible that we might crack 400,000, which would be just extraordinary by Vermont standards. I think that I mean, in a lot of places in Vermont, there isn't much on the statewide ballot, or the local races aren't particularly competitive, but there's so much interest in the national scene.
Mhm.
Um, presidential, the average turnout in a presidential year versus a non-presidential year, it's like a 20% difference or more.
Mm.
Um, so, we will definitely have way more votes than were cast in 2022, for instance. And I think that has a direct bearing on how the results will go. I think it's going to help the Democrats a lot on what might otherwise be a difficult year for them, because there
I'm
are
curious, John,
there
I just want to jump in there because I think one thing that I want to make sure our listeners are aware of is how many Vermonters either split their ticket or don't vote down ballot.
yeah,
Um, and that might really shape a lot of what's coming next, right? So we know that the governor keeps on getting elected by Democrats, right? Or at least people who vote for Democrats in the presidential race.
mhm.
Um, in Vermont, it's not even clear what makes you a Democrat or a Republican. And
It
then if they've split at governor, where might they go from there? That part's sort of unclear, right?
Well,
Um, and so
historically, they've tended to make an exception for the governor and vote for all the Democrats otherwise.
absolutely. Yeah.
That's not a sure thing. And you
No.
know, I lived most of my life in Michigan, where there has been forever and ever a straight ticket option on the ballot. You can check one box, or the old machine days, click one lever, and you have voted for the entire party ticket of whichever party you favor.
Hmm.
Wow.
And
Wow.
if if the Democratic supermajorities were interested in trying to cement their advantages in the future, they might consider making that change to our election law. But
I can't imagine that ever happening.
No, I aren't we doing thing or are we working on anything around ranked choice voting?
We are. It's gonna Hillary Francis is the town clerk in Brattleboro is like on the advisory committee for that or something like
Okay.
that. And it's gonna be a slow road because of how confusing it is, basically. And they
Mm-hmm.
really want to be careful about not
it's
messing
easy to
things
get it
up.
wrong, and you have to roll it out carefully and sort of educate voters on what's going on.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah, well that's probably one reason we won't see the whole like press one button and vote for one
Yeah.
party anytime soon. One of many reasons.
I mean, one of the funny things though about ranked choice voting in Vermont is that like most of our races don't really have more than two candidates.
Hmm.
It would be interesting to know to see if we do get ranked choice voting, if the Progressive Party steps back from its current strategy of running most of its candidates or all of its
Mhm.
candidates in Democratic primaries.
Mhm.
Um, if they saw ranked choice as an opportunity to establish more of their own identity and run their candidates purely as progressives. I do not know. I have no idea if that might happen, but that is one potential outcome of ranked choice if we do implement it at some point.
Mhm.
Hmm. So going back to the voting system we have now, um, we were talking before the break about money and where it's coming from. And for a lot of folks on the Republican side, John, you were saying there's a kind of a cluster of business folks in Chittenden County that are giving to a lot of Republican candidates. But Emily, you started asking about, okay, now the candidates have the money. What are they doing with it?
Well,
Is it going to TV buys or mailings or what?
I would even I wonder where else things are happening that are funny. So I have a Republican running against me. It's not a very active campaign from what I can tell. And I've already done all of the things, so I don't really have like a lot of things left to do.
Hmm.
Um, and but she like bought some lawn signs and put them out. And so I was like, oh, I wonder what her campaign finance report looks like. And so I looked it up like just yesterday. The lawn sign's been out for a while. And she's only received one donation, and it was from someone that I had never heard of in Grand Isle, maybe. Um, and so I wonder how much, there are Republicans down here who could give, right? Um, and so I wonder how much there is like for maybe it's her like sister or something. I really don't know who this person
Hmm.
was. But I don't know if like maybe there if that's also happening in other smaller Republican races. And if that like if there's a matching of funds that's happening as well, in addition to these huge dollar.
Hmm.
Because in past years, she wouldn't have even had a campaign finance report. I
Right.
mean, lawn signs are even sort of surprising.
So, okay, this is going to sound like a very catty question, and maybe it is a little bit, but is she so I'm wondering if she's running a real campaign. And I ask that because there has been in the past, at least in Windham County, a number of Republican quote unquote candidates, right? And they got the R next to their name and they're on the ballot, and I'm assuming people vote for them, but they don't have a campaign website. They don't raise money, they don't get lawn signs. And when you're a journalist and you call up and ask them to do an interview, they're like, I'm not giving interviews, I'm not holding events. And it leaves me to wonder if the only reason they're like on the ballot is to be an R on the ballot. So that's why I asked this kind of catty question. Is it even a full-blown campaign?
Well, so here's the interesting thing, and I don't know, I don't want to make it about like this very nice woman who's running against me. I actually don't know if she's nice. I don't really know her because she won't really have a long conversation with me. But what I do know is that, and I'm just curious if this is happening other places. In past years, yes, that's exactly what happened, Olga. And I sort of assumed that was happening because she didn't come to the polls on primary day, and I
Mm-hmm.
called her and she didn't call me back. But I've seen her at two events, both about like sort of along with some other climate denier folks. She's put out lawn signs. She's filed a campaign finance report. Last cycle, I don't think a single Republican in Windham County filed a campaign finance
Mm-hmm.
report, despite spending some money. Um, and but she didn't send a response to the Brattleboro Reformer, which is not like a left-wing rag, let me tell you. And she did not send a response to them, which was like we all got the same questionnaire, and then they published the responses to our questionnaire. She's not interested in doing a forum with me. Um, and so I think it's sort of like a halfway kind of thing, much more than
Okay.
usual. And I know that my understanding is that some Republican candidates are actually purposefully keeping a low profile so that voters won't hear their extremist views, which is like a pretty good strategy.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. I have opinions, but there you go.
There,
John, what are you thinking?
there are a lot of, there have been in recent years, including this year, quite a few Republican candidates for the legislature who present themselves as sort of like Phil Scott style, fiscally conservative, responsible, common sense um, uh, Republicans, when in fact they do have pretty extreme views. They are either, pro Donald Trump or, even like QAnon or anti-vax or, name your conspiracy theory. And they try to hide it under this veneer of mainline republicanism.
Hmm.
The problem is most of them have made public statements elsewhere, either in online videos or online forums or social media. And more often than not, if you take the time to look, you can find evidence of their extremism that yes, they do not talk about when they're campaigning.
And my specific opponent has like no digital footprint whatsoever. So there's no website like you mentioned, Olga, but there's also like no extremist blog on the side that I can find at least. Um, and so that's an interesting balance point. But then so like it's more what my point was in bringing this all up. I don't mean to get into the weeds of it, is that even in a place where normally no money would be spent, money is being spent.
Hmm.
And I was not I took down my lawn signs after the primary. I was not planning on putting them back out because I hate them. With much love to anyone who's listening to this and has been so kind as to host one at the end of their driveway. Thank you. Um, really appreciate you doing that. Um, and so like now I've had to, now I put the lawn signs back out again because
Hmm.
so where else are people? So lawn signs, everyone loves a lawn sign. That's one place that people are spending money. You said sort of these negative mailers from this one firm in New Hampshire. Um,
You were also talking about the consultant out of DC.
Yeah.
what
Um,
does the consultant do Do we know?
Well, I mean, in their case, they are kind of a full service campaign shop. So you can, you can ask them for advice on how to organize and do stuff, but you can also, um, sort of make it a one-stop shop and have them do your ad buys, if any, and your mailers and your printed material of other kinds. Just depends on what you want to do. And some of these Senate candidates who found themselves suddenly rolling in dough have thrown a lot of money at this DC consultant. And I have to think that at best they are getting glossy, well produced, um, sort of like standard conservative stuff. Certainly, somebody in DC isn't going to tailor a campaign to the needs of a district somewhere in Vermont. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I question, I mean, there is a legitimate question to ask, and we shall see what happens in November. It'll be at least a few more data points, whether this money really can be effectively spent in a legislative race. I mean, how many yard signs, how many mailers can you buy? This one candidate in St. Albans, a Republican who bought all this stuff from the New Hampshire printing outfit, has bought 8 separate mailers. Um, our
Wow.
legislative districts, our House districts definitely, and even our Senate districts for the most part, are too small to allow for like electronic media. There's really no point in any candidate anywhere buying TV time or even radio time unless you have a community with a radio station that has an established local identity.
Well, and
There isn't
uh,
much space for that. There is opportunity in digital media, and I have been surprised the extent to which Republican candidates do not use Front Porch Forum.
mm,
And I think that's because there's a lot of feeling on the conservative side that Front Porch Forum is a liberal outfit.
Well,
That
Front Porch Forum does fact check.
yes, and conservative candidates don't like that.
Yeah.
oh, is
Uh,
fact checking considered a liberal thing now?
Wild lefty behavior, fact checking.
it's a violation of free speech, don't you know? So I mean but they're tying a hand behind their back if they don't, because Front Porch Forum is a tremendous way to reach Vermonters
Yeah.
in specific communities. And I think a lot of Democrats take advantage of it, and the Republicans just don't.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know which digital media they're buying their ads on, if it's Facebook or what, but it's almost completely not Front Porch Forum.
It's such an interesting point. This is a little bit of a side road, John, but what you said about buying broadcast media, it doesn't make sense unless you have a radio station in your town per se. And I think in Vermont, there's a real truism to that because we are essentially orphaned in many ways as far as the national media markets go. And I was thinking as both of you were talking, I was saying, boy, I haven't heard radio ads for any Vermont candidates. And then, duh, Olga, most of what I get on the radio, with the exception of Vermont Public, comes from New Hampshire or
That's what I
Massachusetts.
thought. I was like, of course you haven't.
But I just take that for granted, water I'm swimming in kind of thing. And so it does make the where do you put your money question that much more interesting. Because I'm sure there we have enough border communities that I'm not the only person in this situation, right?
Mm-hmm. A lot, yeah. No, I mean, it's one of the reasons that like spending in Vermont is sort of complicated. It's like down here, our entire media market is a Massachusetts media market, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't actually buy airtime here.
Right.
Yeah.
But I do remember that my opponent in the primary actually bought radio ads, like near the end of the campaign, and I was like, you are really flushing that money down the toilet, sister.
Did I did she buy some up for the river? For
No, I
some
think she's
reason, I
like,
think I heard something on the river
I think it
for
was TSA.
TSA. Okay. Well,
And I was
TSA would
like,
make sense.
and
That's
I was like, oh
local.
wow, that's like 12 people in our district.
That's
Hey, if those 12 people come out to vote, though.
I know.
right. And most of them are Republican voters already. So I question whether the conservative talking points that have been, widely used in this campaign. I mean, the Republicans need to change the minds of quite a few Democratic voters if they're going to win. Voters who have supported Democrats in the past. And I don't know that their campaign material, most of their campaign material and their messaging is really going to reach beyond their base.
Hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
we shall see.
We
Uh,
shall see. We shall see. But I will, I was talking to a reporter who was looking for an angle because they had to do an election, like they had to do another election story, right? And they were like, we were talking about education stuff, and they were like, education taxes are the deciding issue in this election cycle. And I was like, or not. Like, I won my reelection bid. Like, if it's the deciding issue, and it's not November yet, we'll see. But like,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like if it was the deciding issue, we would have already seen it decided.
Well, I'm glad you said that, Emily, because that's one topic that I really expected to hear a lot about in this election cycle after the primary was taxes and education spending. And I haven't heard, I mean, it's come up, and I've heard a number of people on an individual level say they're fed up with taxes, but I don't know. It didn't make the splash I expected
And
as
one of
far as
the,
talking points.
yeah, the bigger talking point is actually the Affordable Heat Act, which is fascinating because it's not actually law.
That's
We
right. It doesn't kick
basically
in and
commissioned a study.
right.
Study said this thing's going to be really expensive. It's very possible that nothing will happen because the study said it's so expensive. And that's like what most of the mailers are about. It's a tax that doesn't exist
Oh, interesting. I thought parts of the clean heat standard were supposed to kick in 2025.
if we approve them.
Gotcha. Thank you.
and I think there is concern, in some cases dissatisfaction with property taxes. Some communities have seen substantial increases, but there is also a very strong well of support for public schools in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, around my neck of the woods, there are a couple of small schools that might be in line for closure as part of sort of a district consolidation. And the people in those communities want their schools to stay open really
Mhm.
desperately. Um, there are a lot of people who really appreciate and love their public schools. And they may not like the tax bills, but they do like their schools. So I think at most there's a lot of mixed feelings about the whole issue. I think
Mm-hmm.
people want to see some sort of a solution, but they don't want it to hurt the schools.
Yeah.
I will
Well,
s- I will agree with that because I have lots and lots of emails that say, please lower my property taxes. Please don't close my school in the same.
yes. I have covered many a municipal budget session where people say we want lower taxes, but don't you touch our services.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, we are just about out of time. Is there any last thoughts you want either of you want to leave listeners with?
Oh, people should vote. If you're not in that 33% or 32%, vote. I did not get my ballot in my mailbox. There was a little anomaly with the post office, but I wrote an email to my town clerk, and she said, we can get a new one sent to you, or you can just come on in. And I said, I'm going to come on in.
Mhm.
Yep, yep. I'll be helping my mom. Uh, she's in hospital right now, recovering from a fractured femur, poor thing. So, yes, I will be helping her vote next week as well.
Nice.
John, what do you want to leave listeners with?
Well, Emily's message is an important one if people have not voted. they should vote. And they should vote for whatever candidates they agree with,
Mhm.
no matter who they are. I write a lot of stuff about conservative candidates, and particularly those who conceal their extreme views. But everybody has the right to run for election.
Yeah.
I wish they would be honest about who they were, but I certainly encourage anyone and actually admire anyone who runs for public office.
Me too.
It's a big commitment. It's a lot of work. Uh, it puts you in the line of fire in a way that's uncomfortable for most people. But it's important that people take part, whether it's running for office, holding office, or just voting.
Mhm.
Mhm. And
Can I make one more announcement? I'm so sorry.
after I say this, with the election coming close, folks, if you are planning to mail in your ballot, make sure there's enough time for it to actually arrive by November 5th. If you have any concerns or if you feel you're going to have to wait a little bit longer, you might want to drop it off at your town clerks directly or bring it to the polls on November 5th. So, Emily, last words.
The Windham County Democrats are having an election night party at the Stone Church starting at 7 p.m. with special guest Becca Ballant. If you would like to attend, it is free of charge, but we ask you to please register in advance. And you can do that. You can find the links on my social media. It's probably the easiest place, but you can also look at the Vermont Democratic Party like events page, and it's there as well. There's gonna be live music, minimum of speeches, I promise. And it's good night to be in solidarity with folks.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. On that note, we are going to head out here on the Montpelier Happy Hour. But before we do, hey, John, remind people where they can read your work.
It's the Vermont Political Observer. It is a blog, and it is commentary, analysis, and opinion, and sometimes snark. And it is at
I
the
would put the snark first, John, just saying.
and it is at thevpo.org. And if you search for the VPO, you will find me and the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra.
Why, thank you. And Emily, remind us where people can find you.
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and you will find links to all of the ways to get in touch.
Fantastic. And as well as WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro and BCTV, you can also find the Montpelier Happy Hour wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. So take care, everyone, and have a good weekend.